Ahead of the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party slated on October 16th, TVBS commentator Wenchi invited MIT scholar Professor M. Taylor Fravel to share insights on Washington's possible involvement in the cross-strait stalemate.
Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenchi. Today, we're pleased to have one of the most prominent Chinese military experts, Professor M. Taylor Fravel from MIT, as the world is increasingly alarmed by the possibility of a Taiwan Strait conflict, potentially involving the two most powerful nations, United States and China, and Taiwan. In his interview with 60 Minutes on Sunday, when asked to clarify if he meant that, unlike Ukraine, U.S. forces, men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, Biden replied, yes. This is the fourth time President Biden said the U.S. will defend Taiwan. However, each time the White House walked back by saying the U.S. policy toward Taiwan, meaning strategic ambiguity, hasn't changed.
As you know, this is the fourth time that the president, in a TV interview, has made sort of a very clear-cut commitment to Taiwan that isn't consistent with declaratory U.S. policy, which is why the White House routinely and almost now immediately, right, will issue a statement saying that the policy has not changed. Even if the president is reflecting what might be his personal view, given the authority of the president in the U.S. system, his personal views are often very hard to distinguish from policy. But if he had pursued a change in policy, then we would probably expect to see significant changes coming out of the State Department, the Defense Department, the White House, and other government agencies, which we haven't seen. And so that makes me think he is sort of reflecting what his kind of personal view or belief is in a way that is not necessarily fully aligned with U.S. policy, but that U.S. policy itself has not yet changed. But it's a very confusing situation. And I suspect individuals in Taiwan are confused. I suspect individuals in China are confused. And that itself is worrying to some degree, because it means that people may misunderstand what U.S. policy is or may miscalculate as a result.
The fourth Taiwan Strait crisis during U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan put the world on edge. It was also the first time we saw Chinese military encircling Taiwan on full display. Were you worried at that time?
Sure, I was very worried. I think for three reasons. The first, clearly, right, Taiwan is the most important objective or goal in China's military strategy, and has been since the end of the Cold War, if not longer, right? I mean, it's really significant how the PLA has transformed itself. It was much more capable than the last time there was a crisis, which of course raised the question, what might they do? And then the third reason why I was worried is when those military exercise zones or closure zones were announced, they were much more extensive than in the last crisis. They were much closer to Taiwan.
Did the U.S. military learn something from what was shown in terms of military forces during that time?
I have no doubt that the U.S. watched every moment of that, and other allied countries, very closely. Taiwan, I'm sure, was watching it very closely too, to learn as much as they can. The second question, though, is whether or not this was an actual rehearsal. Clearly, they were demonstrating, I think, at a very high level, an intent to carry out a blockade by having these closure zones and exercises very close to the ports in the north and the south of Taiwan. But at the same time, some of the elements of the exercises really weren't ones one would use in an actual conflict. Perhaps the most important part was less about the platforms and more about the ability of the Eastern Theater Command, which has responsibility for Taiwan, to command and control a large and complex operation.
Ukraine and Russia war. Do you think this is prompting another major military strategy change in China?
There isn't a new objective for Chinese military strategy. I believe it remains Taiwan and coping with U.S. Intervention if the U.S. does intervene militarily in a war across the Taiwan Strait, and that hasn't changed. But the war in Ukraine, I don't think, is one of these wars in the international system in the book that I talk about that ought to necessarily prompt China to think about war fighting in a new way.
And do you think the U.S. has adequate understanding of China's military? I think we have the right capabilities?
So I think overall, the United States has a pretty good understanding of the People's Liberation Army. The war in Ukraine does have an interesting lesson, which is the sort of how well how well a country's national sort of estimates are compared to what the reality is. Now, the question is whether or not the U.S. is adequately prepared. Or we don't know if China sees the same window or not. Right? Do they actually see the U.S. becoming much more capable after 2027 and thus having extra sort of incentives to take action now? Or alternatively, are they looking at the war in Ukraine and saying perhaps we aren't nearly as ready as we thought we were? I think we'll just have to see how the situation unfolds. But at the same time, I do wonder a little bit whether or not deterrence has in fact been strengthened by the war in Ukraine.
Well, the last question is, and I can kind of guess your answer, but I still have to ask. Will China invade Taiwan?
I don't think China wants to invade, right? Invasion would be the last resort to reunify. I mean, that's their goal, or that's their goal as they see it. Their preferred means of achieving this outcome is not through an invasion, right? They still pursue a policy of peaceful unification. I still think that for China, because of the very high risks of a major war and the cost, invasion right is not something that they're eager to do. And so whether or not China decides to invade, I think will be more a function of how the politics over unification or reunification unfolds, which includes decisions taken not just in China, but in Washington and in Taiwan as well. There is no specific timeline. There's no 1 year. When 2027 comes up,